about this for several weeks. Jeff Miller and his family is with us. All of them are one. One son's not with us. So glad to have Jeff with us. Again, looking forward to what he has to say. We've been involved with Project Express in various ways for several years. And of course, Jeff, his official title at Project Express, he's the director of the Creation Research Program. And I have a little bit more to say during the worship service about Jeff. Some of his training getting up to this point. He is a biochemical engineer. Mechanic.
Yeah, biomechanic.
Biomechanic. Yeah, get him on. Anyway, Jeff is involved in a lot of things. He's super intelligent. He's a great fellow. We spent quite a bit of time together trying to get him where he could legally drive our old bus. So, he's doing a great job. We're thankful for him and all the brethren at Project Express for what they do. Sometimes it's a thin line between truth and what we have to stand against in the world. The world is very powerful. It's always a battle. We're thankful for soldiers like this. Would you bow with me, please? Holy and righteous Heavenly Father, we are truly blessed this morning to be able to assemble in a place of comfort. Lord, with blessings we enjoy as your children, your precious word. For men like Jeff Miller and his family, that, Lord, have made preparations and training that they can be your spokesman on this earth, and Lord, be able to dispel truth, untruths, and be able to stand for the truth, and so ably preach it, not only to the world, but to all those who are interested, and even some that disagree. But we're so thankful for Jeff and the work he does. We ask you to bless him this morning as he stands before us. In the name of Christ, amen.
Okay, appreciate Brother Jimmy inviting me to come out and talk to you about the work I'm involved in at Apologetic Express in this creation research program that involves a lot of different things, and so that's what I want to talk to you about in my two sessions that I have today. Make sure that I can get this thing rolling here okay. There we go, we're rocking. All right, so here during the Bible class hour, I wanted to highlight for you some of the cool things that are going on the creation science research side of this program that I'm involved in, some of the trailblazing research that we're doing. During the worship hour, we'll look at this a little bit more closely, but believe it or not, roughly a quarter of the American population is now naturalistic in its thinking. In other words, they don't accept anything supernatural as an explanation for what's going on in the universe around us, so no God involved. And so they're not Christian, obviously, in their thinking, and they don't care about the Bible. They don't believe in the Bible. So quoting Scripture to them would mean as much to them as quoting the Quran or the Book of Mormon would to us. Okay, it wouldn't mean anything to us. So they've been fed a steady diet of naturalistic thinking, evolutionary ideas from a young age for decades. That's what we've seen in our country now. And some of those individuals are searching for answers, but they have some concerns about becoming a Christian because they've heard a lot of false ideas about what Christianity entails and about the Bible. Number one being evolution and things like the Big Bang and the age of the universe, whatever it might be. And so they've heard the Bible and creation bashed their whole life, and they're shaken up by the things that they've heard. And so as evangelists, we respond to evolution or whatever false idea they've heard, and we show the problems with these naturalistic ideas so that perhaps they'll be more willing to accept then an alternate worldview, Bible teaching. And so we try to remove the blocks that are in the way of their receiving the truth. But there's another missing step. So what happens in the minds of these individuals when we defeat these false ideas that have presented blocks in their minds? Will they automatically believe in the biblical perspective? No, because when you think about it, when you refute false ideas like evolution or the Big Bang, you leave a void. Okay, so we're not really teaching the truth. That's another step. Okay, we're defeating error, which is essential, but it's not adequate. Okay, so the next step is to then fill this void that we leave when we counter these false ideas. We have to fill these voids with a model that can be shown to actually harmonize with the evidence. So refuting error becomes pointless if we don't then turn around and provide evidence and teach the evidence of the truth. And to the modern American mind, these coming generations, that initial truth will often need to center on some of these scientific matters, because they've also heard a steady stream of not just positive scientific arguments for things like evolution, but they've heard negative scientific arguments against the Bible and against its account of creation and the flood, among other things. So enter modern creation science. Christians are commanded to be apologists, individuals who can give a defense of our faith. And when you think of how our faith is being attacked today, according to the statistics, our younger people in particular, then we can't help but notice that in this day and age, the attack is coming from naturalism. God has been booted out of science, out of the classroom, most of society, and so godlessness is reigning. But we're to be ready to defend the truth to everyone that asks us about our hope. You know, this debate is what ultimately launched the Christian Research Program at Apologetics Press, because it highlighted to me the importance of the creation science concept, and that the creation science aspect of apologetics, especially its relevance for the younger generations. And it highlighted that what needs to be done to prepare for some of these modern attacks. When Bill Nye, the pseudoscience guy, made a lot of the arguments that he did. So whenever he challenged Bible believers, for example, to explain what he claimed were hundreds of thousands of years worth of layering in the ice cores of Greenland and Antarctica, even though the Bible teaches a young earth, well, we have to be able to go study ice cores and figure out what's going on there. And so we need creation science field work to adequately defend the faith, as 1 Peter 3:15 tells us. When the Big Bang theorists challenge creationists to explain how starlight from stars billions of light years away could already be here in only a few thousand years, we have to be involved in creation science field work to provide an answer to this. We have to study the heavens that declare the glory of God, Psalm 19:1. When they challenge us to explain how the cosmic microwave background radiation in space, I know this is a phrase you hear a lot, cosmic microwave background radiation, how that can be explained under any model other than the Big Bang, then again, we as creation scientists have to be able to provide an answer to that. We have to study the heavens that declare the glory of God. We have to study the works of the Lord, Psalm 111:2, in order to be able to adequately contend for the faith, Jude 3. Geologists argue that the fossil record doesn't support the flood, but instead evolution, and the geologic column doesn't support a young earth, but an old earth. Again, we have to do creation science. We have to study the things that are made, Romans 1:20, the created order around us. In other words, sometimes we have to engage in science. We have to be able to do that in order to teach the truth to people and defend the truth. But again, this approach is becoming more and more necessary because of the increasingly irreligious, naturalistic society in which we live. So generally speaking, those who will likely evangelize in the coming years are not self-professed Christians or Jews, like most of the individuals that the apostles and Jesus were dealing with in the New Testament. They're more like the philosophers of Acts 17, who Paul didn't even try to teach Scripture to. And we'll talk about that more during the Bible class hour. It wasn't where they were. He needed to meet them where they were so that he could take them to Scripture. He had to become all things to all men in order to save some, 1 Corinthians 9:22, which, if you'll recall, he was able to do because of his approach, Acts 17:34. And so that's part of what we're doing with AP's Creation Research Program. In 2014, after that debate, the Bill Nye Ken Ham debate, I launched this arm of AP's work and began raising support for this work in particular at AP, getting into positive research in favor of biblical creation, not just negative research against evolution. And so we're getting involved in actual field work, some of which I'll talk about in this lesson. We're studying what needs to be done in creation science and what is being done in creation science. And so we're going to peer-reviewed conferences in the creation community, presenting at conferences, and staying on top of the latest creation peer-reviewed journals. We're working towards gathering more credentialed Brotherhood science staff for further research. The second arm of this work, we're involved in education. So we're making sure that we're passing on the information that we're learning through articles and books, like my book, Flooded, which, by the way, we just got back in the last 2 or 3 weeks, the updated version of this Flooded book that really is a summary of all the work since 2014 that I've done in this area of creation science. Getting involved in speaking. There's a course that I teach for teenagers out in Arizona that I'll talk about during the Bible class hour. Tours at key creation science locations for families and congregations and schools of preaching. Our summer intern program, and an exhibit hall that we've actually begun setting up at Apologetics Press as well. So what kind of a trailblazing creation fieldwork have we been already involved with? A couple of my fieldwork trips, I had the opportunity to participate in geologic field expeditions for several days, traveling up to eastern Wyoming with Dr. Kurt Wise, who's a Harvard paleontologist, who's a creationist, and we studied the Lance Formation. And this is a guy, he studied under the late Stephen Jay Gould, probably the most famous of evolutionary paleontologists of the 20th century. He was one of his students. But we traveled up to the Lance Formation. What is that, and what does it matter? The Lance Formation is understood by creationists to be, this is several layers of rock in the geologic column that we believe are the final layers being deposited in the flood. And there is debate over that among creationists, but the formation is found at the top of what we call the Cretaceous system in the geologic column. This is just under what we call the KT boundary, or the KPG boundary. This is where your Cretaceous rock moves on up into the Cenozoic strata there. And this is the location, this line is the location of a mysterious extinction event that secular geologists have argued occurred 65 million years ago, and are now arguing it's what wiped out the land dinosaurs. About 75% also of other plant and animal species on the planet. So what is the creationist response to this? Well, many creation scientists, again, believe this is actually documenting the end of the flood just a few thousand years ago. And so many, many dinosaur fossils are found in the Lance Formation, especially in the Lance Creek area where this expedition took place. You got Triceratops, Edmontosaurus, Tyrannosaurus, very typical finds there. Now, the most exciting evidences that we studied there for the flood, we found several special layers within the Lance Formation, types of rock that are called seismites. And there's quite a few of these layers, as many as 25 distinct layers. And this is a relatively new concept in the geologic community. Seismites form when you have something like an earthquake that vibrates a layer of wet sediment. So think like sand along the seashore that is getting wet from the tide. When an earthquake happens, it'll shake up that soggy sand. Okay? And then as it is settling, the water is coming up out of this sand, trying to come out of it kind of like magma from a volcano. Well, if that sand then were to become compacted and dry out, and you have a cementing agent where it starts lithifying, it turns into a stone. If you were then to cut that sandstone and look inside of the layers, you see these squiggly lines from that earthquake. These are called convolutions that show you, that this layer has been disturbed by some kind of major earthquake type activity. That's what we call a seismite. It's a layer that'll have this. And so these are fluid avulsion structures. And anytime we have major earthquakes today, like Alaska 1964, 8.2 magnitude earthquake, it will create a seismite in sediment like that. And so that Alaskan earthquake, for example, made a seismite that was about 11 inches in depth. And that's typical whenever we study these rock layers that are formed from that kind of earthquake activity. Major magnitude earthquakes, it'll do that. Now, if the flood happened, creationists would make a prediction, a scientific prediction, and we would say there should be seismites in flood rock layers because they form when you have wet sediment that is then altered by earthquake type activity, and we'd expect there to be a lot of earthquakes in the flood. Genesis 7:11, all the fountains of the great deep break forth during the flood. So you expect a lot of earthquakes and tectonic activity, and so creationists don't have a problem with plate tectonic theory. We just argue for a catastrophic form of that, and I don't have time to get into that during this hour, but suffice it to say, a lot of evidence in support of this, and we would predict that many of today's mountains are forming during the flood because of this process that's going on. When the Earth's plates are moving rapidly, smashing into each other. So if that is true, we'd expect there to be enormous seismites in flood layers. Well, sure enough, that's exactly what we find in the Lance Formation. But there's a catch. These seismites aren't just a few inches thick, like with magnitude 9.0 earthquakes. These are several meters in thickness. These are so huge that there is no modern reference point to understand the power of the earthquakes that are involved in doing this. In other words, there is not a uniformitarian explanation for this. There's nothing going on today geologically that can explain the size, the kind of power required to do this. And so you picture during the flood, the plates moving rapidly, forming mountains quickly. And where we're studying, we're just east of the Rocky, Colorado Rockies, which is exactly probably what is forming these seismite layers. So major proof of catastrophic activity as would be expected in the flood. And so notice this is trailblazing research that provides evidence for the flood and pushes back against these naturalistic ideas. So how would they respond to this new evidence? Well, they would probably say, well, the KT boundary, remember, this is the area where we're working in. They would say this is the line above which you don't see any more dinosaur fossils. We find other kind of evidence for dinosaurs above that line, but not fossil evidence. And so they would say, well, there's something happened at that point that wipes out all of the dinosaurs. And so one theory that has gained traction among secular geologists is the idea that there was a meteorite that caused an extinction event. We find a major meteorite crater off the coast of Mexico, the Chicxulub crater. So this is a representation of that meteorite. Understanding it's a secular portrayal, we would say that when this meteorite hit, it's likely towards the end of the flood, which means that the earth would have had a lot more water still on it that hadn't receded, and that's assuming this is a meteorite crater, and there is debate about that. But anyway, they would say, well, there should be a seismite that would mark that event having occurred. Okay, well, then we can make predictions about that and go assess the evidence and see whether that fits the evidence, and we find that it doesn't. Why? Well, seismites form in water-drenched sediment, which means the material, the sediment in Wyoming had to have been underwater at the time that this occurred. So you would expect a tsunami from a meteorite impact to affect, for example, the southeastern states of the U.S., but the water wouldn't come in until after the event. You got to already have the area wet before it hits, but you wouldn't expect Wyoming to be underwater at the time. And it also doesn't explain the fact that we don't just find one seismite, we find multiple, as many as 25 distinct layers, indicating you got something major going on out there in the west where multiple impacts of some sort are occurring. Again, we would say this is probably the mountains forming towards the end of the flood. Other field work that I was involved in the last several years, back in Wyoming again for a few days in the same area that I was studying seismites, this time studying at the feet of who I would say is probably the leading dinosaur fossil expert among the young Earth creation geologists, Dr. Art Chadwick. And by the way, a lot of these scientists that I study with, these are the guys that are in the movie Is Genesis History? If you've ever seen that, I'd highly recommend it. Those are the leading creation science minds. Dr. Art Chadwick is in that movie, but his team has excavated more than 20,000 dinosaur fossils. And so we went up there, I went up there along with an intern and another one of our auxiliary riders to go up there, Dwayne Bryan, who actually has been at Faulkner for several years now. And we went up there along with Mike Houts, who's a nuclear engineer that does some writing for us at AP, to do some study of these dinosaur fossils that are being dug up there in Wyoming. So Dr. Chadwick is a professor at a denominational university in Texas. The leading creation scientists in the world are denominational. They're not members of the church, which is a concern. Another one of the reasons why in 2014, after that debate, I decided, you know, we got to get the brotherhood involved in this stuff and not be leaving it up to these guys to do all this work. But Art Chadwick teaches geology courses, including a course on dinosaurs and creation. And each summer he brings students up to Wyoming for a month, and they camp out in tents at his site and excavate fossils during the day and hear lectures on dinosaurs during the evening. And so we came during that time period to assist in that. And again, we're looking at this point where we're working is in Cretaceous sediment. At the top, towards the very end of the flood. And so this is one of the primary places in the world where we find Triceratops, but you also find Nanotyrannus and Pachycephalosaurus, for example. Lots of Admonosaurus. So this is a maxillary of, so the upper jawbone of an Admonosaurus that I excavated while I was there. And so we dug up several dinosaur fossils, lots of teeth and tendons and so forth. Now, of course, the most exciting goal of this trip is to continue to gather evidence for the flood in this region of the earth that is in late flood sediment, where that's actually exposed. We can see it, we can study it, and we're given a glimpse at evidence that can tell us what's going on towards the end of the flood. This is when the dinosaurs are getting wiped out. Okay, so this is a big question everyone always has. What happened to the dinosaurs? And this is a question creationists are studying at this site and on this ranch. Chadwick is overseeing the excavation in 5 separate fossil quarries there with, again, thousands of these dinosaur fossils, many of which are being dug up continually every day. This picture on the left is one of those fossil quarries where you can see the fossils in the positions they were found with the dirt having been excavated around them. And as you can see, thousands of fossils. This is the quarry I was working in. And so the excavation team is locating each fossil very carefully using GPS. They take pictures of these fossils and develop 3D representations of each of these, put them back into the picture based on the coordinates so that Dr. Chadwick can study these and figure out what's going on here, what happened to these dinosaurs. And so there's actually depth to these pictures. We're looking down from above, a bird's eye view, so some of these aren't on exactly the same plane. Here's another couple of these quarries. So based on what's already been excavated over the last several years, and by making estimates over the area concerning what's left to be excavated, Dr. Chadwick believes there are over 5,000 dinosaurs represented in this area, where you already had over 20,000 fossils dug up. Now, I don't know about you, it seems to me something pretty catastrophic had to happen to wipe out 5,000 creatures and bury them quickly where they could be preserved like this. Now, the standard secular explanation for what you see in this area is, okay, well, these dinosaurs died out gradually over time as they're trying to cross a river during flood season, and the corpses are washed down to a river bend where they then get piled up over time, gradually get covered up. And so they say, see, that would explain how this wasn't some global catastrophic process. Well, again, you can take that theory and make scientific predictions and then go do actual research and see whether the predictions fit that theory. And you find there's major problems with that theory. For one, the bones are not found oriented as would be expected in a river current. As you have things moving down a river, they tend to orient themselves with the flow of the river. That's not what we find. They're randomly oriented. So again, the thousands of bones that are being excavated by Dr. Chadwick and his team at this site are documented with multiple GPS points so that they know exactly where the bones were found and their orientations. And the bones are not found in a current orientation. Also, the bones are not found piled as though in a river bend. They're randomly distributed over the entire area. So taking the sites that have been excavated, which continue to grow significantly every year, and extrapolate to the areas he hasn't yet excavated, this is what you have. And also these bones are disarticulated, meaning that the skeleton of the whole intact dinosaur is not found. The bones are found separated, isolated from each other, and usually just pieces, shards of these bones. And so if the corpses are piling up on a river bend, and then in order to preserve these bones for fossilization, you've got to rapidly bury them. So you would expect at least some of the remains to be articulated, the bones together as skeletons or partial skeletons. That's not what you have in these quarries. There are disarticulated bones. And if the dinosaur corpses are being successively piled up each year, you'd expect there to be animals in layers, bone beds on top of each other, representing successive events. Again, that's not what you have. Instead, the dinosaur fossils are in a single graded bed where you have the larger bones at the bottom and they get smaller as you go up, indicating a single rapid catastrophic event that moved material a long distance and organized the bones by gravity as it moved them. So what kind of single event would be necessary to kill 5,000 dinosaurs, tear them to shreds, move them huge distances, and organize them like that? Well, again, there is no uniformitarian explanation of this. This is further evidence of what's going on in the flood. So a model that fits the facts, a single catastrophic flood, such an event would be able to create a single graded bone bed like the one these dinosaurs are found in, capable of creating the type and structure of stone. You see the dinosaur layers in there, and capable of causing the mudslides that would catastrophically bury some 5,000 dinosaurs and preserve them for fossilization. Keeping in mind that these are not little dinosaurs, okay? These are big ones, okay? These big guys are being killed by something, obliterated, and moved huge distances. And this is, by the way, remember where the seismites are that I'm studying. Some of these dinosaur fossils are sticking out of seismites. And so they're getting obliterated by the power of these earthquakes as the Rocky Mountains apparently are being formed. Over the last several years, I've been studying the origin of caves from a biblical creation perspective. I've been studying the caves of the eastern U.S., the Appalachian Mountains, as well as the caves of the Ozarks. Caves have long been argued to be evidence of an extremely old earth and against the biblical timeline. Conventional thinking, especially prior to the 1980s, was that these solution caves form. These are caves that are formed from dissolved rock, which is what most of the caves are that you think about whenever you think of caves. They argue if you go on virtually any cave tour, they're going to say that, give you the same narrative. They say that these form slowly from carbonic acid, slowly dissolving rock. And so they think rain, as it's coming down, it picks up carbon dioxide in the air as it falls to the ground. Then it hits the ground and starts soaking into the earth, and the water, as it's seeping through the earth, it picks up more carbon dioxide from decaying plants in the dirt, and that turns the water into carbonic acid. This is the stuff that makes your soda fizz, right? It's a very weak acid. And when that acid percolates downward and reaches a rock like limestone, it'll slowly dissolve that rock. Very slowly, because carbonic acid is a weak acid. And so it'll eventually, over hundreds, thousands, millions of years, form this underwater hole. So over thousands and thousands of years, in many cases, this hole is getting bigger and bigger, eventually forming a cave, and then the water table either lowers or the ground gets uplifted from tectonic movement, and so the hole empties of water, and erosion at the surface finally uncovers the cave. Now, obviously, that narrative doesn't fit the biblical timeline, because they're talking tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, millions of years in some cases, so we know that's not right. And most caves are found in Paleozoic and Mesozoic rock layers. So this is flood rock to the creationists. This is not day 3 rock. And so arguing that God just directly created these caves miraculously doesn't fit the evidence either. So what's going on here? So these are caves that seem to have been formed after creation. Are caves evidence of an extremely old earth, as conventional geologists have argued? Well, since the 1980s, another kind of cave dissolving process has been acknowledged and is quickly gaining traction in the secular community as an explanation for the origin of many caves. So instead of rocks being dissolved very slowly by descending carbonic acid, caves can form much more quickly if they're dissolved from below by other stronger acids that are ascending. Like sulfuric acid. And so this process of cave formation is called hypogene speleogenesis. So cave formation from below, from deep-seated ascending acidic waters. Heated waters can be in both in liquid and in vapor form, rather than from descending water from above. By the 1990s, 10% of solution caves had been recognized by mainstream geologists as being formed from hypogene speleogenesis. That doubled over the next 2 decades. Now speleologists are estimating most caves may have been formed in this way, and so the number is continuing to climb. Based on my research so far, I would argue that all of the large carbonate caves can be argued to be hypogene. Now, and we can see as creationists why this would be attractive. It can fit the biblical timeline, because you got stronger acids. They can dissolve rock much more quickly, 10 to 100 times faster than carbonic acid, for example, in the case of sulfuric acid. So the flood would provide the perfect circumstances for this. You've got deep water. Heat is causing the water to ascend from that magma below, being released in the flood as all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. So acid being created in the mixture of magma with water and oxygen. So hot, rising acidic water pushing upward, rapidly dissolving rock along the way is the theory. So the flood conditions would have been perfect to do this rapidly using things like sulfuric acid or hydrochloric acid in some cases. So what I suggested is I think that this is the primary mechanism of cave formation. That has to be what's going on. Well, to test that hypothesis, over the last several years, I have studied so far 80 different caves and concentrated primarily in the vicinity of the Appalachians and the Ozark Mountains. These tend to conventionally still be held out as carbonic acid dissolving caves. And so that's where I directed most of my research. And I presented on this at creationist peer-reviewed conferences, and I'm finishing up a journal article on this as well. So this is an ongoing study as I continue to study these. So to determine if hypogene speleogenesis, that is the flood, basically explains these solution caves, then I'm looking for characteristics in solution caves that would support this process, ascending acidic dissolution as the mechanism that formed them. So you're looking for example, entry holes at the base of these caves for acids to come up. These are called feeders. Pathways leading from the feeders to the top of the caves. These are called channels. And then you're looking for dome structures on the ceilings of these caves from that acid going up and then forming these kind of bowl shapes on the ceiling. These are called cupolas. Feeders, channels, and cupolas are your big 3, although there's some other features to consider like superimposed and multi-level cave systems, which are also hypogene characteristics, not easy to access in a lot of caves. Now, in every case where checkable, we see these main features that you'd expect to find if they were formed rapidly through hypogenic processes during the flood. We find the feeders, including mega feeders, huge holes from a lot of material coming up during the flood. So again, think Genesis 7:11. At the beginning of the flood, all the fountains of the great deep are broken up. Water, acid, magma, all would have begun rising. We find the channeling, usually ceiling channeling. So, you know, if water is descending, you expect channeling on the ground. You don't expect it on the ceiling, right? That tells you the opposite is going on than what they think. And that's exactly what we find. We find bowls on the ceiling, not on the ground. Channels on the ceiling, not on the ground. This is exactly what we're finding in all of these caves. And then you find also these, fall in, by the way, can erase some of the original evidences of hypogene speleogenesis because it erases all the ceiling structures, the cupolas and so forth. And then also stalactites and stalagmites can cover all that up sometimes and make it where you can't see these features in some cases. But in spite of all those limitations, we find clear examples of wall and ceiling channels in all of these caves. I vividly remember the first cave I examined after studying about hypogene speleogenesis, and it was Carlsbad Caverns, which is already acknowledged by mainstream geologists to be a hypogene cave. And I was having trouble finding the cupolas, the domes on the ceiling on this tour because there were so many stalactites and stalagmites and so forth. And I had about decided that the tour was not going to take you to some of these off the tour paths that would show me some of these features. And then I remembered what Kurt Wise had said whenever he was teaching me about all of this, that there's a tendency to think too small in the secular community and even as creationists, and you got to think bigger when you're thinking about what would be going on in the flood. And right at that time, I was in the big room at Carlsbad. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Carlsbad Caverns, but think, you know, an entire city inside of a room. Okay, that's basically the big room at Carlsbad. It occurred to me this whole thing may be one of these dome structures from a huge amount of rising acidic water during the flood. And as the tour went on, as we're exiting the big room, sure enough, we find a massive feeder that's like as big as a house right off the edge of this, just exactly as you'd expect if hypogene speleogenesis is what is forming these during the flood. And then those dome structures, again, we find these in the ceilings of each of these caves. Cupolas in virtually every cave, including mega cupolas, okay, huge ones like the big room at Carlsbad Caverns. In rare cases where you don't observe some of these features, there's inevitably extensive fall-in where the caves, the fall-in has probably erased a lot of these features, but even then, that is a rare case. And it doesn't mean the features weren't there. It just means it's indeterminate in those cases. Instead, we find very consistently exactly what we expect if the flood formed these using hypogene speleogenesis. So what about speleothem growth? Speleothem is just the term for all these cool features in caves, stalactites and stalagmites, all that stuff. So these are what we call secondary features, because they form after the cave is initially dissolved. So they start filling the cave with these features after the cave is already filled. So secular geologists have argued they only grow at about 0.01 cubic inches per year, so 1 inch every century. And some speleothems are so huge that it would take tens of thousands of years for them to form. And keep in mind, that's after the cave itself has already been formed. So even if the flood can explain the rapid dissolving of the cave initially, how do you explain speleothems in just a few thousand years? Well, the answer, of course, is that geologists are assuming uniformitarianism. That is, they're assuming speleothems have always grown at the same rate you see them growing today, which they say is a cubic inch every century. Now, the problem is uniformitarianism doesn't fit the actual evidence when you observe these growing, even today, in many, many cases. Many factors play a role in how fast these speleothems grow, including the amount of rain at the surface, the air temperature of the cave, the amount of carbon dioxide in the cave air, as well as in the ground above the water that's trickling down, the evaporation rate of the water in on the speleothems, the drip rate, the calcium and carbonic acid concentration of these droplets. So lots of different factors here. And in the years immediately following the flood during the Ice Age period, there would have been much more rain, leading to faster drip rate, much higher levels of carbon dioxide in the soil from dead plants and animals, leading to more calcite in the droplets, lower temperatures above, leading to wider stalagmites. The rocks themselves would have still been warmer, therefore leading to faster evaporation. So the circumstances are just right for rapid growth of these speleothems. Now, the estimates of flowstone growth are on the order of, again, about a cubic inch every century, or 0.01 cubic inches every year. The actual empirical evidence, again, does not fit that. Even today, much less during the Ice Age, or Ice Advance really is a term we prefer to use. Nearly every tour guide in my travels highlighted they'll give that growth rate of about a cubic inch every century, but then they'll say, now, interestingly, in our cave, it doesn't really fit that. So they'll give the party line on how fast these grow, and then they'll say, we're apparently an exception. Now, you might not notice how many times there's an exception unless you go to 80 caves like I have, where this is very common for them to say, in their cave, it's a lot faster. So, for example, tour guides for Squire Boone Caverns in Mockport, Indiana, showed me a stairwell leading down to the cave that they built in 1973. So it was 46 years from when I visited this. So if these speleothems are actually growing at 0.01 cubic inches every year, there should have been about a half inch, about 1/2 of an inch of flowstone in this stairwell. Instead, flowstone covered most of the walls of this 73-step stairwell and was 2 to 3 inches thick in several places. So the size of speleothems, not a problem for the young earth position that the Bible teaches. So I'm intending to continue to move forward and look at other caves in the coming years, and maybe even jumping across the pond and start looking at some caves elsewhere in coming years on this. My book, Science versus Evolution, we have available at AP, that's relevant more on the negative against evolution stuff, but the book, Flooded, is available to you, that summarizes so much of the work that we've done in the Creation Research Program on the science side of things in the last, I guess we're up to 12 years now. So exciting stuff, very relevant and recent evidences that continue to provide support for the biblical flood, the biblical timeline, both issues that are causing many young people to abandon their faith, right? That's key here. So many young people are abandoning the faith over thinking that creation does not have the ability to explain scientific observations. They've been taught from a young age that creation requires a blind faith. They don't realize that the evidence does not support evolution, it supports creation. We've got to be ready to be able to show this to them and show them that there's lots of creation scientists. We're doing the work that actually supports what the Bible teaches on this. All right, thank you for your attention. We'll go ahead and stop for the hour. Yes, sir.